she had never taken mushrooms, but she went to some new age thing. This is at the Garden Row. Anyways, she immediately started tripping out. She saw a vision of a silhouette and she goes, it was Jesus. And behind was fire. What? Her friend who was next to her, she goes, I see Jesus. And her friend goes, you don't even believe in Jesus. And she goes, I do now.
I didn't know anything about the Bible, but I heard in an inaudible voice, I've always known you. Dude, that unlocked something for me.
So when you guys look back at your own stories when you were skeptics, is it so cool to see it come full circle now that like you are reaching the people that you once were?
Some Christians are afraid of questions and doubts and things like that. And I think, doubts and questions are not the opposite or the enemy of faith. Doing nothing with them is.
Life is wild. Faith, marriage, parenting, work, all of it. 1 minute you're inspired, the next you're in chaos. That's why I started No Longer Nomads, the podcast that throws you into the deep end of real stories and authentic truth. We're talking ex-witches who found freedom, former Muslims who met Jesus, mountaineers who even survived the wilderness for 6 days, and much, much more. No Longer Nomads, because no one was meant to wander alone. New episodes drop every Tuesday at 5 a.m.
Skyler, Nolan, welcome to the show. Tell the people about you, where you're at, a little bit about yourselves. And Nolan, hit it, man. Love to hear.
Well, cool, man. Thanks for having me, Josh. Appreciate it. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I was atheist. I didn't love Jesus. I'd heard about Jesus a little bit from my mom, but by the time I'm like a teenager, the Pacific Northwest is really progressive in its thinking. It's very worldview-wise contrary to Christianity. And so I'd started to embrace all of the tenets of atheism. And so I kind of accepted Charles Darwin into my heart and had rejected all the truth claims of Christianity that I'd heard a little bit from my mom. We were in a church family. My dad wasn't into it. Like, he was a hard worker, good dude. But I think I just followed in the footsteps of my dad. Like, there's probably nothing really there. Until one day my little brother had gotten baptized, started to go to church, and he had invited me to come to student ministry a few times. Dude, the first time I went, actually, there was this lady, and it was something called Trash Can Wars. Do you remember that, Skyler? We both came into the same student ministry, and that Trash Can Wars was like literally the funnest thing. And literally you have the crusty church lady who's like, young man, come here. Your pants are sagging. What are you doing? That's not how we dress at God's church. And I was like, see, I don't belong in a place like this. Dang. And, but I got invited again. He was persistent. I ended up coming to his baptism, actually. Fast forward, it was actually his baptism. By this time, I got it a little out of order, and seeing all these other dudes from my high school at that baptism, like, opened my eyes to, actually, there's normal people who are religious. Like, wow, that's crazy. And so it kind of lowered my defenses. When he finally invited me again, and I came out of guilt to the actual service, not just like a game night or a baptism, it was me sitting there in a dingy, lame student ministry. I think they had just changed student pastors, smelled like mothballs. It was like an old people type church in general. And the guy's reading out of Mark 9. And I didn't know anything about the Bible, but I heard in an inaudible voice, I've always known you. Dude, that unlocked something for me. Like, there was this whole longing to be truly known, to like have something beyond what I think human relationship offers. I think everybody's kind of longing for that. And when I heard God speak to me that way, it opened my eyes. I didn't know much about the Trinity, theology, anything like that, but I knew, like, whatever Jesus is, I want that. I want the more that is obviously on offer. I became the kid in student ministry that was like all in. I didn't know much, but I was hungry. Dude, this is funny. My student pastor at that time, every teaching afterwards, I would come up and be like, all right, so you're talking about this Moses guy. Like, who is Moses? And he'd be like, dude, don't mess around. I'm like, no, like,
no, for real.
Like, who is Moses? And he'd be like, okay, well, let me take you back to this one book. He explained it. Next week, he'd be like, Abraham. I'd be like, who's Big Abe? Can you walk me through that? I think he got so tired of my dumb questions that I'll never forget, he handed me my own like NIV study Bible. Last piece here in my story is I met Skyler through a bunch of my buddies. I started dragging all of my like knucklehead, metalhead buddies and, you know, everybody from the sports teams or whatever. Like these guys are all like unsaved. They don't know who God is. And so I wanted them to come in. We probably lowered the average sanctification of that student ministry by like 50 or 60%.
So which is good, man.
Yeah,
very good, right?
Full circle as a leader, I'm like, that's what you want.
Yes.
But Skyler was one of those dudes hanging out, going to shows, a really cool guy, but like not a church guy. So I'll let you kick it off there and finish out the story of how you became a Christian.
Yeah, I didn't grow up in the church. I was a happy atheist. I wasn't very, you know, it wasn't based on like a bullet point list of here's the reason why I don't believe in God. It's just, I just accept the fact that there's nothing in this world. You know, just pretty typical. I think people use religion as a crutch because they can't cope with the hard things in life. That was my mindset. So, you know, I hated Christians. They annoyed me. So I did my due diligence just to irritate them.
Is that still now that you're pastoring, or is this before? No, I'm kidding.
I rolled into high school. I didn't like Christians. I started moving in a direction that was not good with partying and that whole scene. We actually persuaded the friend that linked Nolan and I was a good friend. My friend Robbie and I, we persuaded him to go to a party after he came back from a retreat, fired up on Jesus. So we got him to stumble in his faith. He was so remorseful. I think for like 30 minutes, he just sobbed and apologized and said, you guys just don't know how much God loves you. And it was super weird and uncomfortable for me. I conceal my emotions. I don't expose my emotions. And it was real, like, uncomfortable. So we started walking back after the party. And I made a pledge, hey, I'm going to stop drinking and I'll start going to church. And it's at that very night that Nolan and I actually met each other. Prior to that, I am told that Nolan didn't like me. And it was for a misunderstanding. I think he thought I had the hot sphere girlfriend, which was not the case. Anyway, so
what year of high school was this?
So maybe 2007.
Okay.
Yes. 6 or 7.
Cool.
So, and Nolan's mom just had like these Holy Spirit fire moment of truth. And so I made a pact. I would stop drinking, start going to church. So I got kind of grafted into that friend group, and Nolan and I developed some of deep friendship out of that. And man, I ended up getting converted over to Jesus because I just had some really clear moments where God was working. So, I mean, the only way I can explain it is I went from atheism to a Christian to becoming a pastor because I felt like God was really moving in my life and had intervened in my life. So yeah, now here I am. And it took me a while. Skepticism was strong. So I used to joke early on, I got to convert my inner atheist and just continually battle those doubts. And so all of that just kind of launched me into ministry. And went to Bible school and ministered all over the states, California, Illinois, Oregon. Now, the Lord opened the door for us to come down and join what the Lord's doing here at the Garden.
You guys started the podcast, and I love some of the language too. Tell me about the podcast, the name, and kind of the story behind it, because that was what immediately drew me in, and I'd love to hear from you guys kind of what the idea was behind all that.
Yeah, dude. So we lead a church called The Garden, and that's even its own crazy thing. About 2023, I moved down from the Pacific Northwest to the Southwest because that's where a lot of people were going, and God's heart beats for people. And so we wanted to reach a lot of people. And what we found is we're a church at the Garden for, we say, skeptics and saints. So literally, if you come to the Garden, we meet in a high school, but like outside of it, everything's all set up. We do a big black sign emblazoned on it. It says a place for skeptics and saints to consider the claims of Jesus, because we're trying to make a statement to our city and to the entire West Valley of Phoenix that, like, hey, you may be new to all of this. Both of the teaching pastors are guys who have had to wrestle an inner atheist, to use Skyler's language. Part of how we both ended up in ministry is because we were both trying to answer deep questions that we had. Like, just because you get saved doesn't mean you don't have questions.
Right.
And as a Christian, part of how I ended up in ministry in Skyler as well is you go like, I don't know how this works. Like, how does science and faith fit together? You know, like how do you navigate that? Like, are there dinosaurs? You know, are there not? Like, how does that work? Someone hands you a R.C. Sproul book and you just start reading and realizing like, oh, deep, thoughtful, intelligent Christians have wrestled over these questions for ages. And so we wanted to be a church really from the outset that people who have these same questions can feel comfortable coming in and wrestling with us, you know, wrestling with the text, wrestling with the Bible, wrestling with the truth.
Yep.
And so, yeah, the podcast is like Sundays, the lion's share is devoted to like unpacking the Bible. Yes, in a way that skeptics can wrestle through, but like midweek, we found ourselves like we do, Q&As or whatever for people who are new to church. And they're asking all these questions like, okay, what do you think about the Nephilim? Or like, what about everything you hear on Joe Rogan? Like, what about rooms and what about aliens and all this stuff? And so we're going like, hey, like, let's start a podcast midweek where we can just hit it hard with all of these questions that I think people are wrestling through, even non-Christians. And so, dude, it's crazy out there. Like, you start a podcast like that and you do get crazy emails and wild stuff because of what I would call the Joe Roganification of culture. I think men today there is a type of spirituality among non-Christians that makes people hungry to ask deeper questions about life, that makes them want to know the mysteries of the universe. That's literally why dudes like that take shrooms. It's because in theory, what they say is it opens your mind. Now, I'm not recommending mushrooms as a pastor right now. Please don't do that. Why they're doing that insane stuff is because they want their mind to be open to another realm, another reality. And so for us anyways, that's where the podcast came from.
So the people that come to church, are you finding the demographic is maybe folks that don't have a super deep walk? Maybe they are a bit more like drawn in because they are skeptics at heart. If so, I'd love to hear more about that. Cause I know like, I'm not super familiar with the area that you're in, but I know like, you know, New Age and occultism is really big, and it's like everyone is looking for a cheap counterfeit fix, you know, whether it's like, oh, these crystals or these rituals, or, you know, we've had on someone who was a ghost hunter, and she was like, it spiraled so far out of control that she found herself in necromancy. And she's like, I was scared to watch horror movies. And then here I am like going into these buildings and telling people like, if your spirit, use my body. Now that's an extreme example, but you know, with you guys, are you seeing some of these folks that maybe are, skeptics at heart, or maybe they come from these backgrounds that like, you know, or they're looking for something deeper?
Yeah, dude. So like a couple Sundays ago, there's a gal that now serves in our church, but when she came in, she was practicing New Age, crystals, the whole nine, suicidal, and was looking for something more, still open to coming to church, apparently came through, and asking those deeper questions like, why isn't this actually scratching the itch? So you talk about like, there's something down there that there's a need, there's a hunger that needs to be met in spirituality, what I would call actually neopaganism, but it's not being met. And so they're still open to coming to church. Yeah. So huge around here, huge, especially up in Sedona, if you know where that is, but definitely in the West Valley as well. Well, anyway, she received Christ, accepted Jesus, ends up getting baptized with us. And not only that, goes home and burns her magic books. And so like we like to tell that story over and over again. Now she serves on our production team. She's awesome, dude. She doesn't know everything about theology yet, but she's learning and hungry and growing in the Bible. Yeah. There are a lot of skeptics of different kinds too, dude. We call them West Valley Wesley, right? The kind of dude that comes to the garden. Skyler, I'll kick it over to you. Like, what's your experience? Because Skyler joined our church later. Like, we'd always been BFFs, but I hired him recently as the church has grown, and I'm like, bro, I'm overwhelmed. I need another guy who can open God's word and do this, because like it's a lot of big Christians, and we're hiring staff, and he was in a transition. So, like from your perspective, Skyler, like how has what do you see in the church? Like, what kind of people are we reaching? And
you know, one story that pops in my head, we did kind of like a get together. You know, are you new to the church? Let's just talk about that kind of class, and. She was on on her way to becoming like having her own crystal shop, doing new age, palm reading, all of that kind of stuff. She was getting her PhD somewhere on the East Coast and was going to move back to the area. The plan was to own a shop in Sedona, got a good marketplace there for that kind of stuff. And she had never taken mushrooms, but she went to some new age thing and she took some psychedelic mushrooms.
This is at the garden, bro?
Yeah. She immediately started tripping out. And she said she saw a vision of a silhouette and she goes, it was Jesus. And behind it was fire. What? Her friend who was next to her, she goes, oh my goodness, I see Jesus. And her friend goes, you don't even believe in Jesus. And she goes, I do now. She ends up giving her life to Christ. And her whole life and marriage is transformed. Now her husband is, I want to say he's at Grand Canyon, GCU, but he wants to be a pastor. So anyways, there's a lot of stories like that. I think every church has a lot of transfer growth. Christians come from other churches, and that's fine. There's a disproportionate amount of people who are just genuinely not Christians. Who oftentimes, like this was unique, a lot of people who are not Christians heard about the garden because of social media. And then they decided to follow the stream and the YouTube channel, and then showed up at the garden and had been pretty radically transformed. So there's a lot of people who are asking lots of questions who have zero knowledge of anything biblically.
Dude, if there's any number we get most excited about, it's the number of baptisms. Last on this is we had 375 baptisms since starting this church. And that's the number we get most excited about. 90 of those were just this year.
Man, praise God.
Pray for us, is those are the kinds of people that I think Jesus moved towards, and we want to too.
That's so cool. Yeah. So when you guys look back at your own stories, when you were skeptics, when you were, like you said, you had that inner atheism you were battling constantly. Is it so cool to see it come full circle now that like you are reaching the people that you once were? And like, is that cool to be like, man, that is me? And does that make you feel maybe prepared in some of the way you can handle conversation? If you didn't go through some of the stuff you went through, do you think you would be equipped to handle, if someone's coming in, they're like, hey, I was just tripping on shrooms and I saw Jesus, I'd love to hear, what you guys think about that. I think from the outside, it's so cool. Your faith, your obedience, stepping out, listening to God and what he's doing in your stories and reaching people. Just like how you were walking the same road, and very similar parallel there.
Some Christians are afraid of questions and doubts and things like that. And I think you can let those become detrimental to your faith, or you can let them become constructive. Doubts and questions are not the opposite or the enemy of faith. Doing nothing with them is, and for me, having a bunch of questions has given me an unbelievable amount of curiosity where I cannot not research something because I just want to get to the bottom of it. I want to understand it. So there's a satisfaction in learning for me. When I became a Christian, that grew, and I remember reading Paul's words in 1 Corinthians where he says, to the weak I become weak, to the strong I become strong, I become all things to all people so as to win some to Christ. That's kind of my loose translation. For me, if I'm going to relate to anyone, I need to understand where they're coming from. So, I wanted to understand Mormonism. I wanted to understand, you name it, so that I can better relate the gospel to them. And so, that level of curiosity and questions never ended. And I would say it's because of guys like Nolan, where I didn't know there was questions you shouldn't ask. I didn't know there was any kind of boundaries, around those things. I just asked them. And I had guys like Nolan in my life that I would just say, hey, what do you think about this? Or, whatever. And he would always say, well, what does the Bible say about that? And we would just kind of go from that. So having that modeled helps me as I talk to other people, just to go, man, ask the questions. Like, it's okay to wrestle through that and just to think through that and research.
Yeah.
It's good.
I think the one of the things I double click on, and by the way, it's flip flopped now. Now I ask Skyler all the questions because he's got the seminary training.
There we go.
And it's a fun, cool, like full circle God moment. For real, it's like a really cool thing for me. To have him as a mentor as well as a good friend, because I got to baptize him. So like God just has that in his economy that he raises up who he wants. But yeah, so like growing up in Portland, especially, like Portland's a really unique place, you know, everything that people value in Sedona north of here. And there's a lot of people that are here that think this way too, I think are cut from the same cloth as everyone in Portland. In fact, Portland's almost like ahead by 10 or 20 years of the rest of the country in terms of its spirituality, worldview, ideology. Portland and major cities like Portland, but especially Portland, are ahead in that regard. And so like in Portland, like everyone grows up like on crystals and crystal meth. You know what I mean? Like it's one of the two. One of the two groups of people that I would say in atheism or in really in a non-Christian category are the magician and the materialist, right? So like the magician person who's like interested in spiritual things but not religious, or the materialist who's like, we essentially crawled out of primordial soup. We're here because of a cosmic accident. We are computers made of meat. And so in some ways I feel like connected to those people because that was my upbringing and that was his upbringing. Not because my parents, but because I had adopted the mindset and ideology of the culture. So the other thing is my entire story lends to it for me personally. So like Skyler got seminary trained, he stayed in school, and I was a fool. And so like I left Bible school. We went to the same one. I ended up getting married. My wife and I did ministry in the church, a small group leaders, but we were just normal Christians, kind of like we weren't in ministry. I was working in a warehouse mostly and some construction. And most of my ministry training was not in either a seminary or in the church. It was just like evangelizing dudes in the warehouse. You know, by the way, I'm a ballin' forklift operator. So if anyone was good,
if we were getting in a pinch,
I might not have that degree, but yeah, hit me up. I'll fly out. And it's the guys in the break room who are like, all right, like, why not Buddha? You're into this Christian thing. Like, why not Buddha? And just going back and forth, guys cornering me at, when I was a coffee roaster and a bean delivery boy, guys being like, hey man, like, doesn't God hate gay people? And be like, okay, why do you ask that? There was this thing in the news and like, I know you guys are bigots. Let's talk about it. I'm like, all right, let's talk about it. And that was my seminary training.
That's a bigoted thing to say. I always love that. It's like they can throw it at us all day long, and then not a two-way street at times. But yeah, sorry, keep going. That's cool though that you're able to like, hey, let's have a conversation about this.
Well, dude, so when we're talking about people that don't know Jesus, and you know, maybe that's some of you guys watching, I think there is a power in understanding that everyone starts somewhere. And maybe you're watching a pastor online, or maybe you're listening to this and you're like, these guys have it all together. It's like, well, nobody had it all together. Yeah. And I certainly don't right now. I still have questions. There's this dude, I'm training my puppy right now, bro. And there is this dude who, he does puppy training or whatever on YouTube. And they were like, how do you train a puppy? He's like, I treat these dogs like a dog because I am a dog. And like, when you watch him, you're like, you are a dog, dude. Like, you're actually an animal. And he's like, because I am a dog, I know how to treat dogs. I'm like, because I have an inner atheist, like to this day, bro. I am you. I think more like people curious about Christianity need to realize like the dude on the suit in the suit on the stage is not a sage. Like, he's somebody that at one time was probably a skeptic. Sure. And so that's been helpful to me. But yeah,
that's so good and important, because we can oftentimes hear worship the person on the stage or create idols out of people on staff, or, you know, oh, I saw so-and-so in the hall and they said hi. And it's great, which that's great, you know, but I think oftentimes we can follow people and not Jesus. And you can see that show up in some circles. We see it here a lot in some of these bigger churches, right? They get 5,000, 10,000 strong. And you do see people really follow the leader, and which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it turns into, in some of these churches and some of these circles, you can see kind of like an idolatry. It is crazy when there is moral failure, there is something, and it just does destruction, to the church. All right, we'll get back to it. So tell me about, Nolan, you're about to go. What are you passionate about right now? What's getting you going in your ministry right now?
I feel like we've been chosen for this moment. I think that whether you are in ministry, whether you're a Christian or whether you're a non-Christian, that there is a unique event taking place in history, and particularly in the way people view the world. That during COVID, so the reason why I even started the church was because COVID woke me up. I think it woke a lot of us up. We had a pandemic. Nobody had ever experienced that before. Remember, everybody was saying, this is unprecedented. And I think it feels like we are entering into something of an apocalyptic age where everyone from online concerns with the AI apocalypse to zombies to aliens to whatever it is, one of the biggest interests for me right now is, what does it look like to walk with Jesus in the apocalypse? What does it look like to walk with Jesus when what we used to know as normal is no longer normal? There's been like a seismic philosophical earthquake, and people are awakening to there is something more. And I'm talking about like non-Christian people, right? People like me before becoming a Christian, people like Skyler, where you're going, all right, I don't know if I believe in anything, I don't know if I believe in organized religion. What I do believe is it's not just a material universe where there's nothing on the other side. There must be something on the other side of the veil. What is it? There is a interesting guy called Leslie Newbegin. He's a dude, but anyways, that used to be a dude's name. And he talks about this whole idea of how each culture changed its spirituality over history. So like most cultures begin in what he called a pre-Christian or a pagan state, right? So like they believed in many gods, either the pantheon, or even if you talk about like Native American spirituality and pantheism or panentheism. If you're familiar with all those terms, basically there's different spirits out there and you can appeal to them or connect with them. And there's various ways that paganism unfolds, but all across the world, whether you're talking about here in the United States, whole people groups in villages and never even heard of each other have this same spiritual understanding all across the globe. This is the same thing. And you have to ask, like, why was it the same thing? It was like the Wild West of spirituality before the Christianization of the world was a belief in many spirits. Well, then later, what happens is Jesus comes down and Christianity explodes. The God of Judaism comes down and we see the fulfillment of the Messiah. And Christianity essentially sweeps through the globe and takes over almost every pagan culture. And the culture of the world spiritually goes from paganized to Christianized, and we call that Christendom. This is just like true in history. You could study secular history books. Then fast forward, what happens through the Enlightenment and many other sociological realities in the West is people deconstruct Christianity and embrace a materialist worldview, embrace an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, where everything there is fits within the singular box, right? There isn't something on the other side. It's all perceivable in the universe with your five senses. And so we're just enclosed in this universe. The universe created itself, essentially. And you go from a belief in Christianity, which believed in the virgin birth, to a belief in materialism, which it believes in the virgin birth of the universe. They're both a miracle, but what miracle are you going to choose? And people have opted for the miracle of a virgin universe, from nothing universe. Then fast forward, what happened in the world, though, is we're in this right now. So like that's been our history up until this point, specifically in the West, but really across the world, is I think, and I'll probably point to COVID as one of the main turning points here, but it's been happening, that people are no longer persuaded of atheism. I think naturalism has had its day, and now the world is becoming re-spiritualized. So what's fascinating to me is not all of that is Christian, not all of that is even Muslim or any other major world religion. Instead, it's like people are now reopening to paganism, and it's like a neo-paganism is taking over. And that's what I was kind of pointing to earlier when I talk about like the Joe Roganification of the world. It's not that we're Christian and maybe we're like a little bit interested in the Christian narrative. In fact, like there's a resurgence of the interest in the Nephilim. We recently did a couple of podcast episodes. dude, why is it that every dude, whether he's a Christian or not, that comes to the garden is like, all right, what's your stance on the Nephilim? I'm like,
They here, or they gone. The flood take them out, or are they still with us? Yeah, dude, it's crazy.
At that point,
It's what?
so
we performed the exorcism at that point.
Full on. It's like, just come
that's
here.
Nephilim spirit. And by the way, I actually think demons, I'm kind of with that a little bit. Like, I actually think demons are likely Nephilim spirit, but that's a conversation for another day.
I don't know, like when you guys covered it, did you get people coming out of the woodworks wanting to talk about it? I mean, that's kind of what brought me in, honestly.
This is one of Skyler's topics, dude. Like, so I don't know if you want to speak for yourself, but you were big into Second Temple Judaism for your seminary, your master's degree.
Yeah.
This is like, he's like kind of the guy for this topic, but
Subjects that interest me are Second Temple Jewish period, and just kind of the writings and everything kind of developed from that period, and how that relates to the New Testament, and then Mormonism. So those are like my two, like,
dude, we have so many Mormons out here, bro. It's crazy.
Dude, my best friend, one of my good buddies growing up, he was and is a Mormon, and great family. They were right next door neighbors, and they'd bring me to their Mormon camps and all that, and it was super uncomfortable, but nicest people. Yeah, I mean, we can get into
very
some of that
holy
too.
underwear with the Mormons,
Dude, and also like the amount of documentaries on the Mormon people. My wife and I binge those all the time. Have you guys watched Keep Sweet Eat and Pray?
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorites.
That
good.
one's brutal. And then the false prophet one that just came out. Did you see that one?
I think so. Yeah,
It just came out on Netflix. Check that one out if you haven't. It's nutty.
that's nutty. Good. That's good. Yeah.
Well, dude,
I don't even know what the question was.
There was no question. No, we were talking about just kind of second temple Mormonism, what you're into.
Yeah, I got really fascinated. I mean, natural. Like, here's the backstory, and I'll try to keep this real short, so I don't lose anybody's interest. But I was a fully naturalistic way of looking at the Bible. Everything's supernatural.
Sure.
I don't know. I just gloss over that. Of course, Jesus can do miracles and some of these other things that I just would breeze past and not even consider them. I did a series at a church, and I just said, hey, ask any question you want, and I'll take a Sunday and I'll answer it. Somebody asked me a question about the origin of demons, and I thought, well, that's fascinating. Where do I go with that? So I locked into a book by Michael Heiser, and I read that, and it just blew me away. And I was so frustrated that I had such a naturalistic way of reading the Bible that I missed what was obvious in the text. So I was going through seminary at the time, and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? We were going through the Gospel of Mark, and I thought, the Gospel of Matthew, and I thought, I'm going to pick one of the demon possession passages, and then I'm just going to go deep on that passage in all of the Second Temple literature. So I just spent probably an unhealthy amount of time reading up on that, and then I wrote a paper for my class on that, and so that's what has consumed me, and it's been a fun fascination to better understand the New Testament, be a better student of the Bible, and how would a Jew and a Christian in the first century even begin to organize their thoughts and their understanding around supernatural beings and all of that. And you can't avoid it. I mean, one, it shows up within the text of the New Testament, and two, that's just their worldview.
My favorite question, though, that we get all the time is, what about the female Nephilim, bro?
Oh, yeah.
Nephilim. So, Skyler, people are listening, they're like, who are the Nephilim? I mean, I think most people, with what's going on in culture today, break it down, kind of who the Nephilim, where they come from. Is that biblical? Is that in the Bible? Yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that.
So the Genesis 6 is a story. So this is like the flood narrative, the flood story of how God wiped out all of creation because there was nothing but evil in it. There's a couple of really interesting things that happen in the text. You have the Nephilim that are there, and you have, depending on, the translation, there's the mighty men of old. all of that, but you have a reference to the sons of God. If you go through, okay, so let me just define what Nephilim is, and then we'll kind of go backwards on that. From an ancient Jewish perspective and even early Christian perspective, the Nephilim it's the byproduct of the relationship, the sexual relationship of angels with these daughters of man, and they produce these half-breed creatures that were giants, completely evil. They didn't belong in heaven or on earth, and so there was this inward torment. And so that's kind of what they are. And then the flood came, and this isn't a lot of Jewish literature that's out there, but the flood came and there was a judgment on them. And so their bodies were destroyed, but the spirits continued to exist. And so from the Jewish perspective is these spirits, they are homesick in a sense. Like they're roaming the earth seeking to be re-inhabited, to re-inhabit a body. And so that's where demon possession, things like that comes in. That sounds so crazy to an American. That's just commonplace in the first century. I mean, so much so that you have church fathers that when they go to critique the Roman philosophers and emperors and things like that, they just bash the Roman gods of like, hey, did you know that your gods are they're actually the product of these angels.
They're bastard.
They're
gods.
bastard. These bastard things. So they just assume that's true. You have different places in the New Testament where there's references and strong imaging that's happening there. So I guess when you go to Genesis 6, the reference to that I guess is important is the sons of God. Most of the time, that phrase "sons of God" that is used, it's the connotation is angels. We're talking about a class of angels, and you find that consistently through the New Testament. Of course, there's a couple instances where it's talking about humans, but the majority usage of the phrase "son," Old Testament sons of God, is in reference to angels, not to humans. And so you're alerted in the text that there's something deeper happening there than what meets the eye. And so you have a bunch of other things that are happening in the Old Testament that is not really elaborated on, but there's enough there that by the time the Jews are in exile and they're coming out of exile and they're in the process of translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they're rubbing shoulders with the Hebrew text and trying to figure out how to bring this to bear in a Greek-speaking world, but they're also interacting with the other nations, and they're having to, I don't know, how are we going to reconcile all of that? And so they, as they translate that, as they're wrestling in that, my opinion is that they create these narratives, these commentaries on some of those key passages in the Bible to try to explain what's happening. It's not explicit in the text, but it's there. There's a gap, and they're trying to fill the gap in a way to explain what's happening and really like why all these other nations have these pagan gods and these deities and things like that. So I don't know if that answers the question. So
why do you guys think people are so fascinated with Nephilim and this topic? And, I'd love to hear your take on that too. Is it because people think the Bible's boring? It's because like, hey, that's not biblical, or I've read the Bible a ton and I wait, there's half gods that came in and like angels had relations with women and created giants. And like, what do you guys find, why do you guys think, and I'd be curious with your episodes too, like what brought people in and why do you think people are curious?
I mean, to be fair, I do think there is a biblical merit. Like we would both agree with the concept of the Nephilim and the disembodiment of the Nephilim. So I think part of it is that. But C.S. Lewis in his book on demons, basically in the Screwtape Letters, at the beginning, he talks about there's two equal and opposite errors. It's a very classic thing that's quoted that you can have in regards to demons. Equal and opposite errors you can have with the demons. One, you can dismiss them as though they don't exist, or two, you can have have an unhealthy and undue interest in them. I would argue that a lot of people are more interested in questions around the Nephilim than they are in questions around discipleship and raising your kids in the Lord, in part because of an unhealthy interest that has been produced by the neopaganism of today.
Yeah.
That the Joe Roganification of the world is driven by algorithms, of course, because everything controversial or everything unhealthy or strange draws people in because we're always drawn to what we're afraid of. And then part of it is like, I think guys are just being repaganized. The guys are more fascinated with that than they are with their own children, more fascinated with that than they are with the God of the Bible. Like, name someone who's blowing up YouTube right now with theology proper and a study of the Trinity. There ain't nobody growing an Instagram or a YouTube or a TikTok with like, we're just going to walk through the Trinity and worship God, Father, Son, and Spirit. No one gives a rip. And I would caution if like that's you. Look, we talk about Nephilim all day, but partly because I'm also like, I would say both of us are doing the work of knowing God. Like, don't do a deep dive on the Nephilim if you haven't studied the Word of God. If you're not passionate for the whole book of Genesis and you're just zooming in on Genesis 6, you need to ask yourself, why is that? And could it be that the enemy's number one tool is not always lies and even evil? He'll be satisfied to teach you distracting and unnecessary peripheral truth. Like, if he can't deceive you, he'll distract you with periphery things. But that's my take.
You know, I think there's something that, you know, with the unique moment we're in, I think with the rise of social media, everybody getting on there, really giving people who shouldn't have a mic to be able to air whatever opinions and controversy and conspiracies out there has created its own fanfare.
Come on.
And I think you know, this time in which we live, there is this rub against and pushback against authority. So, you know, you even see this with the anti-evangelical movement with, you know, deconstructing a lot of fundamentalism.
It's massive.
Whatever we can do to paint the Bible, Christianity in a new light, a different light. Maybe that's kind of evangelistic of like we're trying to draw people in to meet Christ and we're saying it in new ways, or maybe that is in a spirit of deconstruction. So I think there's part of that, and I think that is a byproduct of some of the things gearing up to and after COVID with everybody being online now. For me, like even with the subject, man, the reason this is fun and it's interesting to me and I love digging into it is because it better helps me understand the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels.
That's right, bro.
And what, you know, if that's true, it also has implications for today, and that has implications for my parenting and my pastoring. And if you miss that theological chronological thread, and you're just locking into the Nephilim, like, dude, those are demons, right? Like, there's a reason Satan, demons, and all of that do not show up very much in Scripture.
And I agree with that social media take. I think that's a really important take, that there are too many people that have marketing competency, but not Christ-like character. They have a competency that outpaces their character or their calling. And social media has given a platform to people who are underformed. And so I think just being really careful to decipher who just has a platform and who actually has been formed. We're in a culture today where I think that's going to increase, dude. And I don't know, maybe this is too far off into the end times conversation, but like, I think there is, so I'm not like a rapture guy or whatever, but I think there is a lot of truth to what some of my rapture brothers talk a lot about, the great deception. And they're always talking about how Antichrist is going to come and deceive the nations. Well, I'm a believer that the Antichrist has there are many Antichrists and we've already seen them, but the Antichrist spirit is here alive and well, and he's been doing his work. Not that the final Antichrist is here, but there is going to be a great deception. I think AI is probably going to be part of that. I think that we are seeing some of that take place through social media. To me, it's not that I don't respect people who don't have a local they're not a pastor of a local church. Just many people I respect, like say Ruslan Katie, like I love that dude, right? I think he's solid. Actually, we have some connections and stuff, but he's a guy who is anchored in the church, capital C. Like he's locked in. I know his pastor. His pastor's a good friend of mine. Like he's plugged into the local church. And I think a lot of people are just out there on a platform, but you don't know their character, you don't know their family, they're not tested and qualified, and yet they have these big platforms, and so it's driving the deception rather than the truth. So just be careful who you listen to.
Yeah, man, that's good. Go ahead, Skyler.
Yeah, dude, I was gonna say, even on a positive note, you have really good scholars who are giving great insight, like Bible Project, man.
Come on, bro.
That has
They're great.
of fantastic theological worms that I think for Christians who are hungry, they're scratching a very deep itch. And so I think they're helping thinking better and biblically about some of these subjects. And, like Michael Heiser and things like that, who just kind of cave into some of the strangeness of the Bible. And so I think there is a healthiness in that, but there's a fascination that has captivated our culture.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey guys, thanks so much for joining the show. We'll see you guys soon. Hey, next time we'll be in person, all right?
All right, man, let's do it.
All right,
I love
take
that.
care, guys. God bless. Yeah.